I usually take notes during our interviews to help me write the show notes later on. However, in this interview with Ken Shelton, I quickly put my pen down, realizing that so much information was being provided in such an articulate and precise way that I would miss out on my learning due to my futile attempt to take notes. Ken spoke to broad topics while also providing specific supporting details. You will hear how Ken teaches about change management in schools with DEIJ as a lens for personal growth. Ken describes some of the methods he uses in his practice. His delivery technique is to work with school communities to grow their individual and community self-awareness. Through self-discovery and building of understanding, Ken helps his audiences see themselves and their community with new eyes and perspectives while opening the door to critical conversations. You will hear me note how Ken has a liberal arts approach, incorporating sociology, psychology, philosophy, and anthropology in his work. Audrey also points out that Ken comes across similarly to a life coach. I think we're both correct in our observation, as Ken builds on Socrates' teaching that life should be actively thought about, questioned, and critically evaluated. This episode was recorded on March 1st, 2024. We now give you the thought-provoking Ken Shelton.
Hi, Ken. Thank you so much for being on Educators Going Global. Welcome to the show. And where in the world are you?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me. And where in the world am I? Is that going to be similar to where in the world is Carmen San Diego?
Yes,
So
absolutely.
we're going to play a game here. Okay, so I'll give you some clues. I'm in a place where it's known for the weather, it's
Ooh.
known for the beaches, and it's known for the stars. And I don't mean the ones that we
Uh-huh.
see when we look up in the nighttime sky. So, for the audience, if you can't guess it, I'm back in Los Angeles, and that is after having traveled to essentially four different cities in the last week, which two were domestic and two were international. So, I had the privilege of traveling to Hong Kong, and then I also had the privilege of traveling to Hanoi, Vietnam, where I was the keynote speaker for the Vietnam Learning and Teaching Conference at the United Nations International School there.
Cool.
That was
Fabulous
yes,
stuff.
that was so cool.
Nice. I love Vietnam,
Same here.
particularly Hanoi. So thank you for sharing that. And, one thing we typically ask our guests is if they have what we call a going global story. Have you got one you'd like to share?
I could share about Hanoi. I mean, I've got lots, thankfully. I was, let me be clear, it is a privilege that I have lots as opposed to only one.
Right.
But I would say the story from the event there in Hanoi kind of encapsulates a lot of my going global experiences. I would say the overarching through line is the opportunity to connect with educators that are either expats from the United States, or there are educators that are from other countries, or that are local educators as well. So, my main story to share around that experience in Hanoi is that it was such a well put together event that Eunice, the school there, they did what I love to see international schools do, which is embrace, empower, and include the local community in the event. So this event had a English strand, it had a Vietnamese strand, and then yours truly got to do both the keynote and my session in English with real-time Vietnamese translations.
Wow.
Yeah, it was awesome. And then I also translated my slides. Anywhere there was text, the slides appeared in both English and in Vietnamese. And then any of the interactive components, if I had it where it was written in English, I also designed in the same platform, I designed a comparable experience for the Vietnamese educators to be able to be fully participatory as well. And so it was really, really awesome. I had such a phenomenal team of live translators, and just I don't speak Vietnamese. I can speak other languages. That just unfortunately isn't one of them. But You know when you're making a connection with people and even with educators, sometimes by the nonverbal and just the nodding of the head, affirmations, the smiles on their faces. They did communicate to me through the translators how appreciative they were that they were able to be fully participatory. And it kind of connects to something that we'll talk about a little bit later in this conversation, because I said, well, when I think about the experiences that I wanted you all to have, I wanted to make sure that you too were seen and heard.
I love that you've woven in the idea of inclusion because that is part of what we're going to talk about today. And so you're walking the talk, baby. And
Yeah.
I love it. Fantastic. Thank you for that story.
And I can pipe in there as someone who's worked in Vietnam and who goes back a lot to generalize. The Vietnamese people are very proud people. And the educators that I've met in my previous school, boy, howdy, they want to learn and they want to be included. And it's great to hear the schools coming in said, hey, we need to bring everyone in to this process. So kudos to the folks at Eunice and the folks who put that conference together.
Yeah, big time. And if I remember correctly, another component to that event was it was literally done in partnership with the Ministry of Education as well.
Smart.
So it wasn't even just that they invited localized educators, they had the full support at the government level as well.
Excellent.
Phenomenal.
And we're going to hit on community and the value of outreach and bringing in all those voices, like you were saying later in the interview. All right, so we're going to do something a little different. We would usually jump right into the guiding question, but as I listen to podcasts that you've been on, like with Dan and John, our buddies, and other information sources, I was just going, man, this guy is on top of the world. He does so many different things. So we will have your full bio in the show notes, but I did want to give the listeners, if they're not familiar with you, a quick snapshot of kind of the Swiss Army knife of the different tools that you can pull out to support schools and communities. And then I'm going to zero in on what we're going to talk about specifically. So your background covers so many areas. You wear so many hats. You're supporting corporations, NGOs, public school systems, and you're also out there helping international schools among many other groups. So some of your expertise includes organizational leadership, which we're going to hit on, policy analysis, inclusive learning environments, anti-bias, anti-racism, and of course, diversity, equity, and inclusion. And then there's the cool part that Audrey and I as instructional technologists also connect with is your work in multimedia literacy, generative AI, cultural intelligence, design and career and technical education. So, Ken, you are a busy and talented guy, and we're very happy you're with us today.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
So let's focus on organizational change and DEIJ. And so we've got a big question for you, and then we'll break it down into more supporting questions. So, what tools do school leaders need in their change management toolkits as they work to design and implement policies, protocols, programs to grow awareness and understanding of the principles of DEIJ within their communities? So, when I wrote that, I was very intentional in choosing very specific words because you do come across as the guy that comes in and helps schools build their toolkits so that they really can follow through on what they're doing. So let's jump right into some of the, maybe not tools, but some of the education areas that it seems you start with when you're working with a community. So let's jump into the question of how does examining habits of mind, cognitive biases, and cultural norms assist school leaders in long-term DEIJ planning?
Can I use that as my thesis for my doctoral, my dissertation? I'm glad you asked that question because oftentimes, before I go deeply into the answer, I'll share with you two and the audience. Oftentimes, people tend to approach this type of work in one of two ways that decreases the likelihood of what I would describe as sustainable success. Either one, they expect the work to operate in a capacity of which it can be microwaved. And what I mean by that is, for example, Well, we'll do a one and done workshop, or we'll do a school-based assembly, or we'll do a PD where all the teachers watch a video and they answer some questions. So that's one. The other one that comes up all the time is, again, kind of in that same realm. Well, let's have the staff do a book study. And so my whole point around that is that in order for the work to be successful over a sustainable period of time, the first thing you must always do is hold a mirror up to yourself. Because the way I look at the whole idea around habits of mind is that organizations have two distinct components. They have the people that operate within those systems, and then they have the cultural norms that dictate a lot of the ways in which the people operate within those systems. And so systems are nothing more than just people. And so you have to support the people in holding a mirror up to themselves to be able to start to interrogate and examine, how am I upholding and in some cases unintentionally perpetuating many of the things that we need to go through the process of examining and sometimes dismantling. And ultimately, some of those delve into the area of the biases that we carry. And I think it's important to point out, especially for your audience, bias is not necessarily a negative thing. It's the way our brains work. We have certain kind of biases that are literally for our survival. It's like, for example, if you go out into, let's say we're out in a forest and we see, for example, bear tracks. How do we know that they're bear tracks? Well, based on patterns. We look at patterns of footprints that are established by certain animals, the size of those footprints, the understanding of the environment, and our biases based on those patterns and historical context will form a thought process. Where it runs a risk in this area, where it runs the risk of perpetuating those habits of mind are the things like, one of my favorite ones to point out is a bias called the bandwagon effect, which is defined as when our desires for harmony and conformity sway our decision making. And so if you think about a habit of mind and a cultural norm in an organization, how often are divergent, innovative, or dissenting opinions encouraged to foster additional thought versus discouraged because it essentially disrupts harmony and conformity? And so that's why you have to hold a mirror up to yourself first. And then once you've examined your own contributions to those, it turns into, now, how do we look at it from an organizational perspective, which I always say are things like, what policies reinforce those things? And I'll do a specific contextual example with that in education. I always say that one of the habits of mind and cultural norms that you want to really start to interrogate, for example, are grading practices. If you think about equity when it comes to grading, a 100-point scale is one example. That's not an equitable grading scale. And I will share with you, sometimes I get the look of the head tilt, or the like, wait, what do you mean? I'm like, okay, let's just do simple math. 59% of that scale represents failure. More than half of the scale is attributed to failure. So that's not equitable. And really, if you really think about it, the margin for success is only 11 percentage points. So one, that's not equitable. Two, how does that potentially reinforce some of the habits of mind that sort and stratify students? And then now when you think about the cognitive biases, there's everything from the bandwagon effect, which my favorite phrase to share with that is that we've all heard in education is, when you ask, well, why do you do it? Why are you doing such and such this way? Well, because we've always done it that way. That's a habit of mind. That's a bandwagon effect. And then when you introduce something that troubles that narrative around, well, maybe we should look at a complete reform of grading practices and policies. It's, well, yeah, but that's going to be too much work. And we really should just stick with what's safe and familiar. And you know what that is? That's called the zero risk bias, because you're estimating there's a decreased risk of not doing something versus a quote unquote risk of doing something. And then next bias that comes in with that is called choice supportive bias, which is you then start rationalizing the choice that you've made to not do anything by highlighting all the positives of not doing anything rather than examining the negatives of not doing anything. So I'll see how it all becomes this. The best way I can describe it is all of those are threads to the same quilt. But the first step to all of that is you have to be able to give yourself the grace and the time to hold a mirror up to yourself and ask yourself many of the right questions.
So you're a thread puller.
Yeah, a little bit.
Oh, I think more than a thread puller. Holy cow. So this does, as we were saying off mic, that Audrey and I were instructional technologists. We were change agents, and we were doing this from a long time ago. Me from even further back, and it was a struggle. I'm just wondering, on a side light, starting earlier in your career, whether you're pulling the threads or knocking on doors or whatever we want to describe, to come in and say, let's challenge TWATI, which is our acronym for that's the way we've always done things. When you began that process, how did it go? Were you just having to persevere like crazy and take small victories when you could get them? What was like then, and how are things going now when it comes to schools being open, but really open to someone like you saying, I'm not going to come in and just do one and done stuff. I'm here to make changes.
Right.
And if you're going to hire me, you got to buy into my program. I'm guessing that's kind of what you say.
Not quite to that degree of a binary, but I will say that education innovation is one of my top 5 oxymorons. Because education, if you think about no matter where you are in the world, applying historical context, education is one of the most conservative, with a small c, institutions that exist. And that may be my opinion, but the facts are, if we all reflect back upon our time in school, whether it's K-12, undergrad, or higher ed, how many things are done differently now than when we were in school? And that even includes to the point of, even when you consider technology, yeah, you could say, well, we're using tech now, but my whole thing is always around, yes, but is tech being used to support higher order thinking, or is it just simply the digitization of lessons?
Right.
And so that's why I always raise an eyebrow when I hear the word innovation used, because I always ask, like, first of all, how do you define it? And then based on that definition, can you show me a contextual example that represents your definition of innovation? And it's often new or different rather than what it should be, which is divergent from consistent or current thought patterns that yields a definitive and different experience and even end result.
Improved result, right?
Yeah, exactly. And sometimes it's not always an improved result, but that's where, when you, to borrow from the design world, that's precisely why the iterative process is essential. Because, oftentimes one of the biggest inhibitors to any degree of change or any degree of growth is this whole mindset that I'm not going to do it unless it's going to be perfect. And first of all, there's no such thing as perfection. And second of all, I always wonder, is that a subversive way of reinforcing the zero risk bias? Like, I see what you're saying, but, and I really want to change, but, I'm going to wait until I know it's perfect and then I'll do it.
Let me throw a couple ideas out there for our audience. I worked at an incredible school in Hong Kong where our gifted coordinator taught the habits of mind to our gifted students and to other classes. So one way to begin this self-reflection opportunity that you're talking about, and to give people the tools to do that self-reflection, is to start teaching your kids and yourselves about the habits of mind. Dr. Costa's work's been around forever, and it makes a lot of sense. And then the other one is Shane Harris, and he's got a book out called Clear Thinking. And it's all about biases, and he's got other books and articles, but it's a huge topic to delve into. And you'll just catch yourself going, wow, I was so blind, I didn't see that. And I know that must be a part of your work as well.
It is. And usually I remind folks to, if they haven't read it, is The Allegory of the Cave, and the whole idea that you can't see past your own shadow. And sometimes you need to be able to take a step back, again, look in a mirror, and that will help provide clarity of purpose and clarity of perspective.
That's awesome. Those are great ideals to strive for.
Yeah.
Wondering if there are other tools and guiding principles other than the ones already discussed that schools should leverage in order to design their new programs.
When it comes to program design and program analysis, to me, the thing is, number one, how does that program dismantle historically exclusionary barriers? And I'll share with you all an example that I know was magnified in the United States, but thankfully, I'm seeing a lot less of it now, is when I look at anything that is related to computer science or STEM. I used to see with a high degree of regularity that girls were not supported or encouraged to take those types of classes. And so then that goes back to the habits of mind, which goes into the whole idea that I bring up a lot around representation, is this mindset that we get. Like, if we don't see it, then we don't believe it. If we don't believe it, we don't do it. And so in that context, it's looking at program design from everything to what are the demographics and the diversity of representation, both in the program, what are the demographics and the diversity of representations and the materials that are used within the program, and then what are the barriers that exist towards students having access to the program. And again, it goes to those two areas that I shared, examining our own patterns of practice, but then sometimes, if you think about some programs, sometimes the programs are driven by explicit policy. So sometimes you got to look at that policy and ask, is the policy creating barriers or is it dismantling barriers?
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
So this conversation I was telling you off, Mike, it just gets me so excited. And that's why I'm bringing in some resources for our listeners, because another resource is the work of Dr. Jim Reese and Dr. David Perkin out of Harvard's Project Zero, where they put together an article years ago called When Change Has Legs. And they talked about 4 legs, and you're hitting on some of them as we're delving into this. And one of the frameworks, the systems, the protocols, leadership. And what really caught my attention with that one was it's just not the head of school or the principal, but they're also the lower level leaders who are going to lead out on the ground the implementation of these new programs. And then, of course, there's the community. And so often, like you were saying from the start, we're not including everyone. And then the last stage is the institutionalization of the process, that it's not tied around one person and then that one person leaves, for example, but it's into the DNA of the community. So if you could speak a little bit more, if those proponents ring bells for you or some others you would like to add.
Yeah, I'm familiar with that. I tend to at least strive to simplify it a bit further into 3 distinct areas, which is people, policy, and practice. And if you think about what often happens around any sort of school-based initiative, how often is it focused only on the people, i.e., we're going to do PD because these are the changes we want to see occur. And then that PD happens and you get, I know the percentages kind of fluctuate, but I always say it's safe to put it at about, usually get about 15% of your, I'm all in, I'm willing to carry the baton, I'm willing to carry water, I'm with you right away. Then you have that large portion in the middle that are usually the folks that are like, well, I'm kind of in, but I don't know. But let me see what direction we're going to go because, bandwagon effect. I want to maintain harmony and conformity. And then there's that 10 to 15% on the other end that are like ardently resistant and I don't want to see the change and I'm not going to do it. The common phrase that I would hear with some of the work I do in education is an educator will fill in the following. They'll say, I've been an educator for fill in the blank number of years, and the way I've been doing it has been totally fine, so I'm not going to change. Again, that's a habit of mine, by the way. And so to me, the whole idea around facilitating organizational change and shifting an institutional culture is it must be all 3 of those things. You got to work with the people. You got to develop a messaging and supports mechanism that says, here is a purpose behind the change that is needed. Here's the why. Here's the data that backs why we need to make that change. Here are the resources that we have. Here's how we're going to allocate those resources. And you essentially create a situation where not only can it increase the likelihood of buy-in / investment, but you decrease the likelihood of any sort of dissension. So that's with the people. The practices are dictated in many cases by the policy. So it means doing things like a policy analysis. So I'll go back to the grading example. If you want to do a shift, for example, on grading practices, first we got to work with the staff on what does equitable grading look like? And why is it important to do that? What does that look like in the context of using our available resources, personalizing education, supporting learners in their own empowerment, supporting the educators in shifting their patterns of practice around grading and how they evaluate student work? That's one part. The other part is you change the whole policy. Here's what we're going to do. So our grading policies have been the following thing, and we are changing these things. And by way of doing those things, by default, you're automatically going to shift the practices. And you still don't get everybody on board. But what I always say is there's two ways to get people on board. There's the growth and support mechanism, or there's a punitive way. Which one of those two is likely to be more sustainable, even though growth and support requires a bit more investment of emotional and intellectual capital? But again, my whole thing is no change is meaningful if it's not sustainable.
So you're answering my question before I ask it, and I love it. The implementation process on how that goes, and then your three Ps, and especially the practices. In a moment, we're going to talk about professional learning. So to me, that seems an avenue that goes hand in hand, that if you're going to help teachers with the new program and you're implementing it and it involves new practices, well, then you're going to really focus on your professional learning that's going to help them with that process, I'm guessing, right?
Well, yeah, I mean, I'll give you an example. So sometimes when I'm working with either specific schools or with districts, and they have certain initiatives that they want to do, part of my program analysis is all of the following. Okay, so let's say we want to get from point A to point B. Okay, so there's our gap. So when we do our gap analysis, the first thing is a resource inventory. So the thinking routine questions I like to ask are, what are the things we have? What are the things that we need? What are the things that we can get? And what are the things that we can't? Okay, so that's the resources. Now let's look at, where are all the people in the organization, or in this case in the school? Where are they in relation to the end goal you want to have? Some are farther along, some are not. How do we design to account for different growth rates, different growth patterns, and different starting points? And then now, what does that look like in the context of your professional growth plan, whether it be going to conferences, whatever you do internally, any one of those things? And then once you get to that, how is that differentiated based on our assessment of where the people are at? You don't want to shoot for the middle, because if you go for the middle, then you're losing out on the two ends. You're losing out on those that are at the higher end, or you're losing out on those that are at the lower end. It's a function of meeting them where they're at. And sometimes that requires more time and energy.
Yeah.
But again, is the goal to just check off a box, or is the goal to see sustainable change?
Yes. And taking that differentiated approach is what we do in the classroom. So why aren't we doing it with our staff? So excellent point.
Well, we hope we do, but yes.
Yes, that is the goal, the ideal.
Yes.
So, what about, we're thinking about measurable change as well as sustainable change. So, how can schools include formative and summative measurements that are aimed at accountability to ensure that goals are met and therefore programs are sustainable? Because it's all about not just talking about it, right? And thinking about it, but figuring out if it's working. So, please speak to that a bit.
Right. Well, I do think that there are different ways to approach it. You've got your qualitative and your quantitative. What I find happens too often in education is we tend to focus on the quantitative at the expense of the qualitative. So if I remember correctly, it's an Einstein quote: not everything that's valued is measured, and not everything that's measured is valued. And so to me, it depends on what the actual shift is that you're looking at. But ultimately, you do want to have, to the point you're bringing up, you do want to have what I say are intervals of measurement. And so let's say, for example, going back to what I shared a couple of minutes ago, let's say, for example, we redesign our professional growth plan. Well, how do we know it's working? Well, first, it starts off with, where are you at now? So we have to have that baseline starting point. And again, it's not going to be the same with everybody. It's not realistic to think that everybody's in the same place and they learn at the same pace. And so for me, it's like, you point out, here's where we're all starting, but this is a goal that we want to get to. Now, what are the ways in which we can measure that? It's everything from getting direct feedback and assessment from individuals. Hey, how are you in the process of this? If you're not making the progress that you need, what are the resources that you need, or what are the resources that will be helpful around that? So that's one type of, at that point, formative assessment. The other one, when it comes to actual numerical things, are things around the overarching data. So it would be things like doing surveys that measure, what do I estimate my confidence is in my growth or the professional growth opportunities that I've been afforded. But again, the thing I always caution is you don't want to oversimplify the human experience into a numerical value, because big data is always true in general, but never in particular. And so the whole idea being, and I'll borrow this from one of my best friends who's a co-author of a book that we're working on right now on artificial intelligence, which I know we're going to talk about that shortly. It's called demarginalizing design. So he has this 3-step process called proximity, humility, and curiosity. And so in the context of your question around being able to assess the goals and the whole idea around program sustainability, how am I putting myself in proximity to those most affected and those most impacted? And sometimes it's just literally talking to them, going, asking the questions. Then based upon that, I have to embrace the whole idea or the mindset that humility is a virtue. And based on that, what am I most curious about? In other words, what questions do I have? And that whole way is how you can, going back to our reference to biases, that is how you can dismantle 2 biases that everybody has, and in many cases are unwilling to acknowledge, which are the Dunning-Kruger effect and the curse of knowledge. That is how you address those, by doing this: proximity, humility, curiosity, in the context of assessing any sort of systems of measurement, whether it be organizational change or program sustainability analysis.
Excellent. Would you be willing to briefly explain those 2
Oh yeah,
effects? Okay,
absolutely. Yeah,
thank
good
you.
idea. Yes, I'm glad you're asking it. Okay, so the Dunning-Kruger effect, and I don't remember the first names, but it's named after 2 psychologists, and it's essentially a bias that people tend to overestimate their knowledge of something. So the easy entry point I share with educators is when you get members of the community, whether it be parents or somebody else, who thinks they know more than you about education because they went to school. Okay? So that's the easiest way to do it. So that's the Dunning-Kruger effect. The curse of knowledge is, and I'll use an EdTech example, is the assumption that because everybody has a tech device, they know how to use tech.
Yeah.
So it's the whole idea around something is common. So therefore, because it's common, that means everybody knows it. That's the curse of knowledge. When I do my leadership development workshops and empowering leadership, that's the one that I always point to that we must interrogate very heavily. It's the assumption that we all work in education, so we all must know what differentiation is, or scaffolding, or innovation. It's the assumption that because these are what I would even argue cliche terms in education, we all know what they are. And I'm like, let's assume that we don't, or let's assume that people have heard them. But what's more important is, how do you define them in your context? And then once you establish that, what's the most effective way to communicate that understanding to everybody? So you see, those 2 kind of work hand in hand. They're almost like siblings, the Dunning-Kruger effect and the curse of knowledge.
Yeah, I would also suggest that there's that curse of knowledge effect around the terms digital native and
Oh yeah.
uh,
Oh,
what's the other one? I can't remember. It's been a while, but
yeah. So I
but you
I
know, like
absolutely reject both of those. It was digital immigrants and digital natives. Yeah.
an old woman like me can't possibly learn any new tech, kind of thing. And also, all students just know everything about it. And I just so
Correct.
disagree, because I've had students who just really struggle with technology, even though they're surrounded
Correct.
by it. And I think
Correct.
it's not fair to make those assumptions. But anyway, that's my
No,
little.
they're overgeneralizations, but that's a perfect example of the curse of knowledge. All students have tech, so therefore they already know how to use it. Not true. First of all, not all students have tech. I know it's not part of our discussion here, but I would just say for your audience, digital equity is real, and it is a thing no matter where you go. Okay. So not all students have tech. And just because I am familiar with a phone, my thing is, okay, you're familiar with a phone, but does that mean you understand how to use it responsibly and effectively in the context of your learning experience?
Right.
I'm listening and learning, and I'm thinking about seeing you go into a school, and I'm going to term so much of what you're talking about here is, in my thinking, is foundational thinking processes and evaluating, like you're saying, what your thinking is, holding that mirror up. And these are very big, thoughtful topics. So I'm just wondering, I'm very curious how that goes, because you're going to also get in I don't know if we call it biases, but your teachers who are super practical, just tell me what to do and
Hmm.
let's go. And you're saying, let's do some real thinking. And this is going to be tough because we're going to look at some areas where you're going to be uncomfortable. And that's going to take time.
It does.
And then and you're not going to get it all done in a few sessions, but you're going to get the ball rolling.
Correct.
And then I guess it's more fertile for you to start moving in on the many topics that you can help folks with. So, how does that go? What does it look like?
Right. Well, of course, for me, my whole thing, the big question I always ask and pose is how do we ensure that our work is sustainable? Because the time spent, especially the synchronous time spent with me, is going to be finite. It will come to an end for sure. That is a guarantee. So, how do we ensure that it is sustainable? And you do get, again, it's the right to comfort. But I do pose tough questions, and I have no problem demonstrating degrees of humility where, for example, early in my, especially in the classroom career, I did a lot of things. I reinforced habits of mind. I did things the way we've always done them. I didn't trouble the narrative. There were all those things that I did. And it was when I started to develop a much more keen awareness of being able to, as we all know in education, quote unquote, read the room. And again, going back to proximity, humility, curiosity, I started asking students the right questions. Number one being, tell me, how do you feel about your time in the classroom? How would you describe your experience? And of course, you get some answers that will certainly expose you to what you are doing from their perspective. That helped a lot. I like to share this in my keynotes, one of my keynotes, that I spent the first 5 years in the classroom unlearning a majority of what I was taught in grad school. Because grad school was focused strictly on theory and out of context applications. And I'm like, yeah, most of that doesn't work. My schooling experience is, that's a whole nother recording, because let's just say I carry a lot of scars and a lot of trauma from my schooling experience. And that goes all the way up through grad school. But nevertheless, the whole idea with educators is I ask the following questions. One is, what's needed in order for you to give yourself the grace to grow? Okay, because if you think about it, what's one of the inhibitors? If I accept the fact that I need to grow in this area, I also have to accept the fact, and in my mind, I'm thinking that I've been doing something wrong. And I hear that all the time. I'm like, okay, so let's start off with the fact that you're not perfect and there's no such thing as perfection. Okay, can we agree on that? Because if we can agree on that, then the next step is, again, what's needed for you to give yourself the grace to grow? And then once you do that, I also point out, and this is a hat tip to all of the indigenous peoples that I've had the privilege of working with both inside the US and outside the US, what does it look like from a community-based approach, i.e., the growth of the collective supersedes the needs of the individuals. I might have needs and you might have needs, but if our focus is on us as a group, then by default, our needs are going to be met. And recognizing that the group will not realize its full potential if the individuals are not all contributing to that. And that's how I work to get higher degrees of buy-in. And to be honest with you, there's still resistance to that, which I anticipate. And so ultimately I ask folks, I think it's become cliche of, the term know your why. I just ask folks, do you understand and can you articulate in a few sentences what your purpose is specifically within education? And sometimes they can't. And I go, but that's okay. And then we go through an activity on that because, my whole idea is starting off with the self-awareness, then looking at your social awareness, then looking at community wellness, and then community growth. And those first two, hopefully your audience is familiar with it. Those first two are within the CASTLE framework. Are you all familiar with CASTLE by any chance? So for the audience, if they're not, it's the Collaborative for Academic, Social, and Emotional Learning. So their framework has a series of concentric circles. And in the very middle, it starts off with self-awareness, social awareness, responsible decision-making, relationship skills, and I forgot what the fifth one is. But anyway, it starts off with those things. And so that's where you can get into those. And then if I still get areas of ardent resistance to even that, I then go into the following questions and I ask, how many of you chose to go into education for two reasons? Either one, how many of you chose to go into education because you lost a bet? Yeah. And of course, no hands go up. Okay. So we know that you weren't coerced into doing it because you didn't lose a bet. So it wasn't something that you had to do. So, next question. How many of you chose to go in education specifically because you want to cause harm to kids? And now, if we can establish those two things as not being a part of the equation, then the other part becomes easy. You see how that becomes in alignment with your purpose. Then I go into, now I want to focus on what's bringing you joy in the work that you do. How do you feel about what you're doing? And we do a whole, what I call is a whole SEL inventory around that. But you see, all of those are foundational components to the work, but it starts off with that. And to the point, David, that you brought up earlier, you're right. A lot of people just tell me what to do. And I'm like, you want me to give you the binder? I'm like, well, I got good news and I have bad news. Which one do you want first? And I go, and if you read the book Win by Dan Pink, you want the bad news first. The bad news is there is no binder. But the good news is, together we are going to construct a binder. But here's the thing, it's not one that I'm going to give to you. You're going to construct the binder for yourself. That's how it becomes sustainable.
Right.
And we are instructional technologists and teachers, of course, and I'm also a counselor, and Audrey is a life coach. And as I'm listening to you as a guy from a liberal arts background, you're bringing in anthropology, sociology, psychology, just so much about humanity as your starting point. But you're not going to go anyplace until you know who you are, as you've said
Correct.
several times.
Correct.
But I'm very appreciative of also how you have questions. You are a teacher when you're up there on that keynote. You are getting people to think. You're asking open-ended questions and you're guiding them to be ready for some revelations and getting them ready to then move on to whatever the goal is.
Correct.
That you're eventually working towards.
Yeah.
We've talked a little bit about professional growth. Let's go a little bit more into it, because when we started, Audrey and I, back in the early 90s, the situation basically was either the consultant would come in for like a day or two, or we would go out to a conference for maybe 3 days. And what often happened is there was a lot of great content, but to use your term, scaffolding, when we came back, the scaffolding wasn't there. The follow through, the implementation, ultimately, how is this going to make a difference for our students? It just wasn't the case. And I mentioned to you off air that I used to do a podcast with Jeff Udick, and he and I would talk about this a lot. This was a ways back. And we talked about personalizing professional learning and having a full spectrum, continuum, and the whole idea that there are certain things you can work on your own, and other learning opportunities would be with groups. And then, of course, there would be full staff work as well. So I'm wondering, what are you seeing out there? Kind of really, what models of professional learning are you seeing? And then how do your services fit into the offerings? And I've got a follow-up or two, but let's start with that.
Yeah, I mean, you do have your conferences. I think conferences are great. If they're well designed, there's something for everybody, no matter where you are in your professional growth needs or your professional growth wants. When it comes to school-based or school-provided professional growth, whether it's internal talent or they bring in a consultant, ideally that professional growth is in alignment with either the current strategic plan or the current growth model that they're looking for. Because ultimately, it reminds me, and I even bring this up when I do a lot of my cultural competency workshops, it reminds me of a quote from a neuroscience professor that is at a university here in Southern California. And her quote is that it's neurobiologically impossible to think deeply about things you don't care about. And that's her quote. Her name is Dr. Mary Ellen Immordino Yang. And so the whole idea around that is, when you go to a conference, you're going to usually attend a session that is in alignment with that quote. It's something that I know is of value to me, either that I can take back directly with my students, or that is for me and my growth as an educator. Where it becomes a lot more difficult is when a school does it, because it's ultimately the whole idea around, well, who's designing the PD and what is the end expectation of that PD? And so, again, a lot of the models I'm seeing, a lot of the patterns I'm seeing tend to be go to the conference, learn some stuff, and there you go, which I work with a lot of districts, especially in school boards, around how do we dismantle and redesign that to not only support you with your professional growth, but my whole thing is what I shared earlier. How frequently are you celebrating, advocating, and amplifying the talent that exists within the boundaries, if you will, of your school? If you went to a conference, hey, you chose sessions that were meaningful to you. What did you learn? How was it of value? And what might that look like to design that PD opportunity for your colleagues on campus? So that's one with that. Then when it comes to the school itself, it goes back to what Audrey shared earlier around your formative and summative assessments around growth. That should be the driver for the PD growth plan. Because what that does, think about it from an organizational perspective. If you're doing it in that capacity, you are dismantling top-down decision making. It's being culturally relevant and responsive to the needs of the educators that now I'm going to connect proximity, humility, or curiosity that are in closest proximity to the learners. So if you're assessing regularly and you're using that as the catalyst for a dynamic professional growth opportunities that the school is providing, you're always going to be in a context of filling the needs and supporting the growth of the educators. So you see, those are two distinct ways of doing it that I don't see enough. And ultimately, for me, whether it comes to program analysis or even in terms of, even to your point, if a school or a district calls me and they're like, well, we want to bring you in to do PD, I'm like, okay, so how many days are we talking? And usually they'll tell me what it's for, but then I will ask, how is that in alignment with your current strategic plan or your current professional growth plan? Because I specifically want to make sure that I communicate to those that are attending the workshop, here's what we're doing, here's the plan you have, here's how it's in alignment with that. Here's what I have planned for us to do. Are there any additional needs that you have that will fit within this context? Are there any additional needs you have that aren't within this specific context, but if possible, we will include?
And that makes total sense with that alignment. And I really appreciate that you come in as an instructional technologist and say, what are your needs? And how do these needs connect to whatever your initiatives that you have in place?
Yeah.
And you hit on the point of the empowerment, giving agency to individual educators. Are you seeing some schools, as part of everyone's personal growth plan for the year, actually put together, in a sense, blueprints of here's what you're going to do individually. You get to choose. Tell us what you want to do. Oh, I want to take an online course. Oh, I want to learn more with AI, so I'm going to go do this. I also would like to work with my fourth grade team because assessment is a big deal this year. We're going to read this book, for example. And then we hear that you're going to bring in some folks who are going to talk to us about XYZ. How can I bring that into my classroom? What are the systems that we're going to have in place, with the biggest one being time?
Mm-hmm.
So, Mr. Miss Principal, tell us how you're going to make that happen to support me in my professional growth. Does that make sense?
It makes total sense. And I mean, the thing about that is always, the way I bring it up is always around, let's look at, especially with leaders, I always look at the fact that in education, we never have enough time. And so for me, it's like, well, why don't we look at how you're actually using the time you actually do have? Because what often happens, and this is one of the things that gets me in good trouble, is I discourage educators from going above and beyond or the extra mile. And there's a specific reason why I discourage that. I do this in my adult SEL workshops, and I said there is a definitive timeline that unfortunately many of us in education follow. So we start off enthusiastic and excited and invested. And eventually that turns into, we just kind of go through the motions. And what I mean by go through the motions, it's a job, we show up, we do our job, and then we leave. Okay. Or we just, we go through the motions. We perform the essential function, we do it. Then that turns into divestment, which means that we do our job, but our mind is elsewhere. We're looking at, well, what are the other things that bring me joy? Then that divestment turns into demoralization. I was invested and I thought it, but now I'm seeing things and I just don't know that I'm making a difference. I don't know if it's aligned with my purpose. It's a job. I'm going to keep it because I need health insurance or I've got bills to pay. And then that demoralization, if it lasts long enough, goes directly to burnout. And so this is precisely why I always encourage leaders, if any part of professional growth or growth you expect in teachers requires them to work outside of their contracted hours, then we need to examine how you're using the time you do have. It is not sustainable to expect an educator, no matter what role they play, but it's not sustainable to expect them to do the essential functions of their job outside of their contracted hours. If they choose to do it, that's an individual's choice. But even that I would question, because I've just seen it firsthand that even that eventually, it might last a little bit longer, but eventually it goes down that path that I just shared with you. So the whole idea around not enough time, not enough time, not enough time, it's, well, let's look at and let's examine, again, the mirror. Let's examine and interrogate how we're using the time we do have. What are the ways in which we can regain that time, whether it be an efficiency of practice or a shift in policy? Or in some cases, what I love to do is I love having educators document a typical day and how they're using their time. And then when you put it down in writing and you see all these things like, now what are the things that I can let go? What are the things I need to prioritize? I have a slide I use in my adult SEL workshops, and it's a true slide. I have a picture of a teacher. It's not the real person, but it's a friend of mine. And I said, I want to know all the things that you do. And she listed all the things she does. And it was a list of like 13 things. And I was just like, holy cow, 13 things? I'm like, well, no wonder you're always tired and exhausted and you're feeling demoralized. Now it makes sense. So of those 13 things, if you had to purge at least 3 or 4 of them, which ones can you let go? And that's what she did. She let them go and she kept the others. And I'm like, now you need to do a periodic self check. Like, am I good? Am I happy? Have I reconnected with my purpose? And so far, yes. But I'm like, but it may come a time where you need to make that list again, prioritize it, and start purging a few more things. You can't be all things for all people all the time. It is not humanly possible. And that goes back to what you heard me share a little while ago, is that a big part of that growth and a big part of that understanding is giving yourself the grace to acknowledge and interrogate it.
I really appreciate your work that you do with adults on their wellness. Of course, especially in the US and probably around the world after COVID. Oh my gosh, I can't even picture what it's like, with the loss of learning and then all the environmental pressures from social learning and the kids struggling with what's happening through the social networking.
Mm-hmm.
So you have given us mechanisms for prepping our thinking about DEIJ learning. Let's take DEIJ as a case study here.
Yep.
That if you were to come in with a school and give them a blueprint, and clearly you're going to start with who they are.
Correct.
What are their needs? What do they bring to the table? And you're going to put on your designer cap to do that. But in general, what would be some aspects of what you would offer them to further their understanding of the principles of DEIJ?
First and foremost, how do you define each term in the context of the school? That it starts off, because diversity is not limited to optics. It's also in the curriculum, the representations in the curriculum, the student population, the educator workforce, what additional perspectives and ideas are sought around problems of practice, pedagogical approaches, resource allocation, narratives that are propagated, all of those things. And the reason why I do that is I can come in and define them for you, but that also means that you are not taking ownership of them or your growth in that context. And so the whole idea being, for a school, if we can establish a community-based and community-accepted definition of these terms, that's one of the ways it becomes sustainable, because it's not me telling you, it's us constructing those together and then you taking ownership over what those terms mean. And then more specifically, what I would say is we define them, we apply their meaning, and we also apply contextual examples. And then going back to what Audrey shared earlier, what are the forms of assessment to ensure that our actions are in alignment with our definitions? And so again, it's this whole idea around not having them be oversimplified terms, diversity of thought, diversity of representation, diversity in the curriculum, the whole idea around equity. For me, I define equity simply as access and opportunity. So, how are we ensuring access and opportunity for the learners, for the staff, for the administration? Inclusion, I always say inclusion is the start, but belonging is the goal. I give plenty of stories of where I myself have been included in spaces, but that inclusion was tokenism because I never felt like I had a sense of belonging. And ultimately, that belonging leads to justice, which is the environment just, meaning is every single individual seen and heard? Do their voices matter? Are they able to assert their agency on topics and or initiatives that are meaningful or important to them? Whose voices are being centered versus whose voices are either pushed to or remain relegated at the margins?
And with your work that you're there face to face, what are some opportunities for that continued, that ongoing learning around DEIJ?
Specifically with me or outside of synchronous contact with me?
With you.
Oh, geez, it's a lot. I mean, I guess for me, my main thing is again going back to what I shared a little while ago. You have to acknowledge that you cannot microwave that work. It's just not sustainable. It's not going to happen. My usual threshold that I always share with schools is or districts is the goal should be a minimum of 30 synchronous hours because it takes that much time. I always say you got to establish social and historical context. Then you got to have a common working glossary of terms that fit within your context. Then you got to examine why you are where you are and then what direction you want to be going. Then we have to look at what resources you have available. Again, that thinking routine. What do we have? What do we need? What can we get? And what can we not? And then you get into the whole idea around, again, with that mirror, holding that mirror up to yourself, it's examining the 12 cognitive biases, of which 6 of them show up in schools all the time, is going through understanding of the complexity and the dynamic components of our identity, which is in 10 dimensions, which are race, ethnicity, language, religion, gender identity, sexual orientation, social class, language, cognitive ability, and physical ability. Okay. And think about those are all parts of our identities where I say some are a choice, some are not, some are socially constructed, some change, some don't, some we're affirmed in, some we are not. All of those things. And I go through a concept of understanding social dynamics of dominance and subordinates. And then taking all of that and now looking at the curriculum and the representations in the curriculum, how we design learning opportunities and experiences, how we design assessments of learning opportunities and experiences, and then what are the cultural implications around things like the types of programs that you offer at school, whether they be unique to a specific identity grouping, any one of those identity factors, to things like the physical spaces, the dynamic nature of classrooms. That's what I'm saying. It can be a lot, but when you approach it from that degree of strategic and methodic purpose, that is where it increases the likelihood of all of it being sustainable. And then even when it comes to international schools, one of my biggest questions is around, how can you point to a policy or a practice that you have of which you can definitively attribute it to diversifying your educator workforce, whether it be in your recruitment practices, where you go to job fairs, or how you're communicating a need on your campus. And why is that important? Honestly, I know the audience won't necessarily see me, but I'm a Black male educator in the US. How come I go to international schools and pretty much 99.9% of the time, I never see an educator that looks like me?
Yeah.
And it's not a coincidence when I'm on the campuses, what usually happens. The kids are dying to talk to me. And I know part of that is a novelty aspect because they probably have never seen an educator that looks like me. But I also know it's like, oh, I can get a different perspective, or I can hear a different story, or even just have interaction with an educator that I've never had before. And it's not a knock on international schools because it's the same here in the US. In fact, Black male educators, the last number I saw, Black male educators make up only 1.4% of all public school teachers in the country.
Wow.
And that gets at the topic that keeps coming up in our other interviews. We're finally waking up in international education. We're holding the mirror up and saying, wow, we really have to rethink our hiring practices when we hire people, how we're keeping them at our schools. And there's just so much work to be done. And I'm going to be very curious over the coming years as you go back to more and more schools that you can start saying, I'm seeing more people that look like me, or they look more like people that I've visited in this part of the world. So you've been incredible in sharing so much insight here. And one of my takeaways is when I look at myself as a guy in his 60s, I've got 60 years of learning, a lot of it good, but a lot of it that needs to be unlearned. And so the idea that it's going to take 30 potential hours for me to really delve into who I am and how I interact with the world and communities makes total sense. And that's the whole process of change. People think it's going to happen so quickly. No, it takes time, especially when you're looking at yourself as an individual. So quick sidelight, putting on your instructional technology hat, where do you see the intersectionality of generative AI and DEIJ?
Yeah, good question. So, in several areas. So, for me, it points to the following things. So, one, when it comes to, I'll start off with the equity piece. And remember, I shared that I define it as access and opportunity. So, when it comes to generative artificial intelligence, the first thing I usually ask is what equity barriers exist to your learners, whether it be, again, even going back to the time, there is an equity gap when it comes to the feedback loop, or there's an equity gap, which this one happens the most, is that students are not able to efficiently generate ideas around a particular topic. And it's not limited to writing, it could be a variety of things. And so, where generative AI comes in is it can essentially close that type of a gap. The equity gap when it comes to everything from the feedback cycle to idea generation to synthesizing information. Where you get to the inclusive and the diversity part that we have to be mindful of is by and large the tech companies, and especially those that currently exist or that are newer, that are propagating an education around artificial intelligence. I would just encourage your audience to go to their websites and look at their design and engineering teams and ask yourself, does that represent diversity in the context of your own student population or of generalized society, or does it reinforce hegemonic representation? And then the justice part goes into both that and then the designs of the systems themselves, which is this whole idea around recognizing that, technology has been touched by human hands, which means that many of the biases that we carry, the problematic things that we think, the problematic things that have been put out on the internet, those are not only going to end up in those data sets, but when you connect that to the design team, many of those are going to be automated, thus exacerbating many social inequities that exist, both inside education and outside education. And I'll even share, because I have it pulled up, these are the questions that I always encourage district leaders or school leaders to ask the designers these when it comes to artificial intelligence. And they are the following: what is the diversity of your design and decision-making team? Are their perspectives and experiences aligned with those of the students? What is their lived experience? What is their lived experience in proximity to those most likely impacted? And then what is the intended impact you want to have on education? How will it counter the status quo? How will it dismantle historical and institutional barriers? And that's my approach with artificial intelligence within the umbrella of DEIJ, is to acknowledge and recognize that tech can be used for good, but we have to leverage it in meaningful ways. But we also have to acknowledge and recognize that there are problematic things that are in the design and that can be automated in the results, which I'll even share with you how I define it. The bias in this context is the potential for automated systems like machine learning models or algorithms to produce skewed, prejudiced, and or unfair results due to problematic data and or design. And my whole thing with that is, if you know that that's the case, if it's predictable, which it is, then that means simultaneously it's also preventable. So now we're going to go through the strategic learning process. If we know that this is the case, we're going to go through the strategic process of how do we approach it to either eliminate or at minimum mitigate those effects.
Well, and I want to also point out what you were talking about off mic was you were saying that when you look at the full field of people who are experts in AI, there's not a whole lot of them that look like you either. So
Yep.
yet again, here you're representative of,
Yeah.
really looking at these built-in biases and inaccuracies and issues that need to be really carefully examined. And I
Yeah.
love it. Good for you. Hold up that mirror.
Yep.
I just have a quick side question here. Since you've worked closely with schools in the US and international schools, are you seeing any differences? Are you finding that working on this type of training really transcends location and transcends the fact that the vast majority of the international schools are private schools? So one would imagine they can maybe pivot a little more quickly. I'm just curious what your sense is in comparing.
Yeah. So, good one. It depends on where I go internationally. And the reason why I say that is I have noticed a pattern around all the following. So, within the US, there's usually two different schools of thought is we have a dire need to engage in this learning, or we don't believe in it and we're not going to do it. Where I've noticed that type of thinking outside of the US tends to be in schools that don't have a diverse educator workforce. And there is the common response I get is, well, those are problems that you have in the US, but we're a private school and we're international, so we don't have those.
Oh, ouch.
Yeah. And that goes back to the mirror because, and I don't hold it against them. I'm like, well, there may be a perspective that you haven't been exposed to yet. Are you open to listening what my observations are from my perspective? I am one individual, but based on what I see, I'm also an individual that can provide a perspective that you may not have been exposed to. The other thing that I notice that is common with the US, outside of the US, are schools that have been established for a while in countries that have a colonial history.
Yeah.
And so, what usually happens is there has been a replication of various socially constructed hierarchies. And while there are folks at international schools that may like to think that they're different, they often replicate those, often. And then sometimes those replications are reinforced in the methodologies and the pedagogies that are used, and especially within the materials that are used.
Right.
And that usually leads me to my big provocation, my big challenge is if that's the case and that's the experience that the students have, then my question is when they go to a higher ed, when they go to a university, because it's usually generally, not always, but generally it's a university here in the US or in the UK, is then are your expectations for the students to retreat to what's safe and comfortable and familiar and normalized for them? Or do you want them to be able to go to a university and be able to make meaningful cross cultural connections and contribute to campus life, thus enhancing their own college experience as well?
Fantastic. I really like the way you show no fear in terms of helping people hold that mirror up to themselves. I'm just one guy. This is just my experience. How do you look at it? Such a coach approach too. So many of the things you're saying, I'm like, is this guy also a life coach on top of all the other incredible skills that he's got? But you really have a coach approach. So I would define the we don't want to make any changes and we don't have this problem because we're an international school mindset as a struggle. But are there any other, maybe you can share some high points and some struggles of your work with international schools around DEIJ awareness and hoping to make change in those communities?
Struggles as far as for myself or with the schools themselves?
Either or. I guess I'm thinking as a change agent where you've run into resistance. And that was one of the things you said when they're the colonial places or places with a not at all diverse workforce. Any other struggles you've come up against, and maybe some high points, some things that have gone super well in terms of schools that have jumped right in?
I would say I have extremes in both. I think the main one is let's start with the low points, the high points. The low points are, I would say, this happened not too long ago. In fact, this happened less than 6 months ago. Was I won't name the school or the location, but it was an international school that the original plan was to do 2 full days of DEIJ training. It was going to be hosted at this school, let's just say school X, and they invited all the other schools that are within a 1 hour train ride of this school. And it was going to be 2 full days. And I wrote up the scope and sequence of what it was going to be. Because I said, if you're going to include other schools, I would love to really approach it from more of a PLC approach, which means that you're not going to pair up with only the educators at your same campus. You're going to pair up with educators who share some element of where you are in your growth that may be on one of those other campuses, because that now becomes part of your PLC, your small professional learning community. We're all set. Couple of schools said, yeah, we actually decided we weren't going to do it. And I didn't get an answer as to why. And so then ultimately it turned into only one school, that one host school. They were like, well, the other schools don't really want to do it now, so we're going to do it. So can you customize it specific to us? I said, of course I can. That's easy. I did it. And I said, before we do it, I have some pre-workshop pre-work that will require no more than 10 minutes of everybody's time, because it will help me level set where everybody is at, so that when we get started, I will already have things differentiated based upon that pre-work. Okay, no problem. And I go, and there'll be some questions that will require some thought. But again, it's only a few questions because I only want 10 minutes of their time. I don't want them to have to spend a half an hour or an hour on it, because I know once you start doing that, you're not necessarily going to get the most authentic answers. Okay, no problem. Maybe about 2 days later, I hadn't sent the pre-work yet. This was about a month out. About 2 days later, yeah, we decided to cancel.
Oh,
And I'm like, why are we canceling? We were ready to roll. If I remember correctly, the response I got was, yeah, the staff is just not ready for it. And I'm like, okay, no problem. I go, well, check this out. I'll be around, but I will leave you with, if you're going to wait until the staff as a whole is ready for it, it will never happen.
yeah.
And that goes back to where I shared earlier around the Castle framework, that self-awareness. And it's the whole idea around, well, I don't know that I need to do that. I can just, you know what? I know I can get a book. And I always say a book study is not when I recommend the growth, a book study is not first, second, third, fourth, or fifth. It is in the top 10, but it's not those. It's all the other things I shared first, because you have to be able, if you think about it, when you do a book study, you've got to be able to apply what you're learning in the book into your lived and relevant context. And you don't know about your lived and relevant context till you do all those other things that I shared first, because then now it's going to make more contextual sense. So that's one extreme. The other one is a series of schools in another country on a completely different continent that recognize a couple of things. So I did a talk at a conference there, and I can even name the country. So the first example, it was in Switzerland. The second example was a series of schools in South Africa. And so I did a talk on the power of language in relation to school culture. And I talked about dehumanizing language and language of othering. And I got reached out to by 2 of the schools that said, your talk resonated with us. We really know that we need to learn in this area. We really want to grow, and we really want to have a much more inclusive and belonging culture on our campuses. And so what it's turned into now is I'll be working with a cluster of 3 schools, because they all recognize that. And one of the things that they're all looking at doing is changing some of the missions and values of the school. But they're all in. They're like, we know that some staff's not going to want to do this, but they don't have a choice. And a big catalyst for them doing that wasn't just my talk. Again, going back to proximity, it was feedback they were getting from the kids. And the kids basically saying, either I've been othered, and they would list what those words are, or, yeah, these things are not cool. We need to do something about this. And we know that if we try to do it ourselves, it's only going to reach a certain point. So I've had several planning calls with them, and they are literally all in on doing that. And I even shared with them, I know we have a full day and it's not going to be enough, but going back to what I shared earlier, what we're going to do is build a solid and unbreakable foundation that the work will live on long after I'm gone, with your current staff, and some of the things that we'll look at around your overall school culture. That will be part of, remember I mentioned people, policy, and practice, that will be part of the policies and the practices with respect to new hires as well. That's how you can assure that it's sustainable and lives far beyond the synchronous time that I will have spent there.
I love that it was South Africa where they've come through some of their tougher kind of policies and mindsets, habits of mind, if you will. And, sounds like
Right.
they just are far more aware of the need to hold up the mirror.
Correct. You're 100. This is why I mentioned the countries, because if you apply a historical lens, one is obvious.
Yeah.
The other one is, trust me, it's there, but it's not as obvious. And that goes back to my comment around the mirror and the allegory of the cave. And,
Hmm.
it's unfortunate. I would say it's a lost opportunity, but one, I never take it personal because I know it's not personal against me.
Hmm.
And two, like I said, it's just a lost opportunity, but I don't gain any degree of satisfaction on talking down to people about that. That's why I just said, listen, you do need to do the growth. And, at some point you may recognize it. And guess what? If you call, I will answer.
And I hope that they will surprise you and call. That would be great.
So do I.
Yeah.
So do I. So do I.
So thank you so much. As we wrap up, you just have so much knowledge, and I could go on and on chatting with you. It's really fascinating, and I'm learning a lot. Are there any other DEIJ related topics that you'd like to address as we wrap up here?
I think we've covered them all. I think, ultimately for your listeners, I do think that it does start off with looking at yourself in the mirror. Like I said, I'm not opposed to the book study. I am opposed to the only will do a book study. And, I do have perspectives, but to be honest with you all, I do always recommend to schools like you brought me in, you should bring somebody else in too. Like all of us, I have my own lived experiences. I have my own realm of expertise, but I also know that there's a whole lot more that I don't know. And, this is my way of countering the Dunning-Kruger effect in myself. And then also addressing the curse of knowledge that, we've done a training and you might think, okay, well, good. We're all set. We all know it, but there's more. And that's precisely why you got to bring in somebody else too. It's what I would say is you want to have a 360-degree view of the work. And then also acknowledging that technically there really is no finish line, that the work is always going to be ongoing and continuous. And ideally, you develop that awareness in the context of our time together to recognize where the awareness is and where the needs are and where to go to fill them.
Fantastic.
I want to, as we finish up, draw the parallels with your work and also Audrey and my work in the field of instructional technology. If you go back to the 90s and the 2000s,
Yeah.
in our work, you weren't quite in the business yet, but our work to help teachers realize that the use of technology from hardware to software wasn't about the technology. It was about teaching and learning, but it was always easy to say, I'm uncomfortable. The kids can figure this out and it's going to work its way out. And over time, if we go to the Diffusion of Innovations book, we get our early adopters, our laggards, and such. A lot of progress was made, but it wasn't until the disruption, I think, of COVID that we really had a huge impact around the world getting us moving. So that happened, something very negative, but we made progress. And I think more and more teachers understand the technology is in the background. It's about how you're teaching, it's about your pedagogy. And we're teaching critical thinking, we're teaching kids to be global citizens, on and on and on. So here you're on your second, maybe you had other pathways on the DEIJ pathway, and you're clearly bringing in all the different skill sets that you probably used then and more. And I'm wondering what kind of disruption might it take to get those schools in one of the countries that you mentioned to say, we have to wake up and begin this learning process. And I wonder if there's anything out there. Otherwise, it is, like you're saying, it's never ending, but it sounds like it's going to be a slog, but one that's well worth it.
Well, historically speaking, it's always, to use your term, it's always a slog. No growth in respect to any equity or social justice issues occurs with any degree of expediency. I know recently you mentioned COVID. So, one of the big catalysts for people at least to start thinking about it was George Floyd. But you notice how quickly that not only faded, but in many cases, especially in certain areas here in the United States, even outside the United States, is we are now in a period of retrenchment, which is, oh, we need to do DEIJ. Now we're, well, you know what? We don't need to do it. And, all those things that we did, yeah, we're going to go ahead and undo them now. So I don't know what it would take beyond just the collective voice to say this is something that we need and it's something that is essential, not only for ourselves, but to better serve the students that we are tasked with teaching. And to recognize, if you're going to accept the fact that technology has us even more hyper-connected, which I do, then there's a whole idea around how do we best support globalized perspective on our learners, no matter where they are, that dismantles geographical barriers and geographical gaps. And it's this whole idea around being global citizens that extend beyond any geographical location. So if that's the case, I'll even use me as an example. It's the whole idea around how many stories of which I am or a representation like me is the protagonist and is done in an authentic capacity are made accessible to students in international schools. And it's not just me, we can go down the list. So to me, it's pretty much going to be in that area, is more of a hyper-localized awareness. And then ideally, from a leadership perspective, it's an acute knowledge of that awareness and a full investment in that growth, because ultimately it benefits not just us, but also the students that we serve as well.
Yes. And it's like with any effort, any initiative, we've got to have leadership. And there are different organizations. We're having different people coming in on the podcast. We're going to keep bringing on these voices and do our best to educate and to get people to just say, wow, maybe I need to look into this. I need to grow my self-awareness. Again, this on so many fronts has been such a learning opportunity for myself, and Audrey was saying the same thing. So thank you for taking so much time to chat with us. And I'm sorry my voice has been so bad. I think the air pollution has been pretty bad here in Bangkok recently.
No worries.
I really do look forward to maybe, every year we get you back on and we talk about how's it going, right?
Yeah, perfect. I appreciate that. Well, I appreciate y'all having me. And if we do that, then I will be able to share details of my books. If I stick to my plan, I will publish 3 different books this year, and one of them definitely is in correlation with, actually really all 3, but one for sure is written in alignment with pretty much most of our conversation, and it's around school/organizational culture, learning culture.
Ken, thank you so much for taking the time to be with us today. You're such a busy guy. It's just amazing. And I want to just say how much I respect and admire your knowledge of this subject and your passion for it, and particularly the way that you convey it to your audience in such a non-judgmental and empathetic way. Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for joining us today on Educators Going Global.
You can find this podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, and all the other usual suspects.
Please subscribe, like us, and leave a review on Apple and Spotify, and let your teaching friends know about us so we can grow our community.
Please reach out at educatorsgoingglobal@gmail.com and join our Facebook group, Educators Going Global, if you have ideas, comments, or wish to share a going global story of your own.
You can also find us on Instagram at Educators Going Global.
Please visit our website as well, www.educatorsgoingglobal.com. All our podcast episodes are on there by topic, along with blog posts, going global stories, and our ever-growing resource library. For now, this is Audrey
And David.
inviting you to travel,
Teach.
and connect with us.